the official welcome to Foresight's Health Extension Strategy Group, which is sponsored by 100 Plus Capital. And we've been meeting for quite a while now, once a week at least. It's really nice to see so many new faces as well. And I think, to kind of like not take away too much from today's discussion topic, I will keep the intros very, very short. The kind of like today's topic came about because Anthony has actually reached out to me a few weeks ago after reading the report of the Sanity Preserver, which was the 10-week kind of like up to twice a day online salon that we did during COVID-19 to make sense of the situation and to try to help projects on vaccines and so on to kind of track and track visibility and to get support. And Anthony, I think, was coming to those meetings quite a bunch, and reached out to me after reading the report and was like, hey, do you know any folks working on this particular project on open insulin? And then when I asked him what else he's up to, he proposed that he actually has a proposal for a pretty kind of like a decisive action proposal that is at the intersection between diabetes, Healthspan, and gene therapy. And so I'm super excited to have him come here and pitch this project. And then in his kind of presentation pitch, he referenced the infamous work, as he said, of Elizabeth Parrish. So I took the liberty, I hope you don't mind, and in fact, I know you didn't, and I reached out to Liz, and it's a tremendous honor, Liz, to have you on board as well, to speak about your specific work, your quite upfront and personal work on gene therapy and how it has progressed since the first time you started. So we're going to start up front with Anthony Franco from the Open Insulin Project. He's going to talk about diabetes, Healthspan, and a proposal for decisive action. Then we have Liz chime in, and then we open up for discussion, try to see if we can connect the dots between their work, try to see if you have any questions, comments. I'm sure you do. And so with that, I will post all of the links relevant to your work, Anthony, in the chat. I would, in terms of moderation, again, remind the group that any questions that are directly relevant to understanding, I would say just go for it, by like politely unmuting yourself and interrupting. If we're on the slide and you don't get this one particular point, that's all fair game. With any points for the actual discussion, I would say mark the question, whether it's a question or a comment, both of them, please mark it with a Q in the chat. We collect them, and then we will take them one by one in the discussion based on how we collect them in the chat. All right, great. Anthony, please take it away with your quick presentation on diabetes, Healthspan, and a proposal for decisive action. I'm really, really happy to have you here from the Open Insulin Project, and I can't wait for what you're going to share with us. Welcome.
Yeah. Excuse me. Again, yeah, thanks very much for having me. I see that I'm in really esteemed company here as far as this kind of research goes. I just kind of mentioned that I was looking at the precedent from Liz Parrish, and here you are, which is, encouraging and a little bit intimidating. Hopefully I live up to expectations here. I did make some slides just because the information that I'm trying to bring together here ended up being sprawling enough that it was a little hard to keep track of, but I don't want that format to discourage anyone from, keeping the discussion informal, as Allison suggested. So, that's really to help me not stray from what I'm trying to communicate, and also help everyone keep track of it. But I, don't want it to be too formal for that reason. So let me try to get these slides on all of our screens. All right. Are you looking at my screen?
I don't see them yet. No, I still see your face. Okay. Did you click share screen down below green button?
Yeah, well, I have that, and then
sometimes if you have multiples. Oh, there's a box, and then you have to click. I usually select the top left one. That's the one that only shares that particular window.
Yeah, so I see that, but there's nothing in the box that I can select, which is a little bit odd.
That window?
Yeah. I have to say I'm on Linux, and I've not had good luck with the Zoom native client. So
I heard that before, yeah.
there is a risk that I will have to switch to the web one, and maybe that will work better.
That's fine.
I apologize.
That's totally fine. If you want to take some time to figure the technical details out, we can also have Liz speak first about her progress on gene therapy per se, and then switch into your project.
Okay. Yeah, that may work better, in fact. So I will yield the floor then.
Is that okay with you, Liz? I hope I'm not putting you in the spot.
That's okay. I mean, I can always, I'm pretty shy, but I have a lot to say, obviously, about patient access. Now, I understood that I was just here for maybe just a 5-minute question and answer based on Anthony's talk, but that's okay. Okay, so I could essentially tell you kind of what we're doing and where we're at right now. And then I did have a little bit of input on the diabetes and gene therapy. And I thought that's why I was coming in. And that was just, I was wondering if Anthony had looked at the neurogenin 3 positive cells and the FOX01 knockouts in order to create beta cells out of those cells. It's basically like kind of turning the gut lining of the body into insulin producing cells, and it could be done with mRNA or DNA. Really cool, but we'll ask him about that later. With BioViva right now, what we're doing is, we've been a huge advocate of patient advocacy and actually getting people to understand their data more, getting them interested in their biomarkers. We've got some amazing research and development going on at Rutgers University that we'll have a paper out maybe at the end of this year or early next year, depending on how long the mice live. And of course, that's been big news. We've been working on a multi-gene delivery method for gene therapy that can deliver multiple genes that will target all the hallmarks of aging. And so that's kind of a work in progress, and it's an expansion progress, and is mostly a platform so we can deliver one gene or multiple genes. But the goal is to have gene therapy for the future that will that targets all of the hallmarks of aging. Maybe we'll have to have a few small molecules as well. So that's what we're doing on research and development. And on patient access, we work with a company called Integrative Health Systems, and they give people access now to technologies that would take 20 or 30 years to get to. It's a great platform technology, innovative drug development site. It will be detrimental to everybody on this call. If you have a drug that you think will work in humans, you've got good animal safety data, you've got some good human cell safety data, we have patients who need access to those treatments. And we have successfully treated a multitude of patients now, and we are compiling all of their data. We have turned BioViva into a bioinformatics company, and we have the first data in the world of what happens to people when they take regenerative gene therapies, and we're really proud of that. So that's mostly what we're doing right now. And of course, COVID has created some amount of problems to travel and made things more difficult, but we're getting around it, and we are still getting patients who need access to technology through really innovative ways to move people around the world sometimes. And so that's mostly what we're doing. And then on our side, to bring more information to the populace, we've launched a Timekeeper kit. It's a DNA methylation kit. It is the most advanced in the world. It's 850,000 data points, and then we're running multiple clocks. So you don't get the average of, one peer-reviewed clock. You're going to get multiple of them. And we're hoping that people, again, get really interested in their lifestyle, what they're eating, their biohacking, and of course, taking it one step further in the future to ensure their longevity, which will be the level of the gene therapies. And I don't know, so What else do you want to know?
Well, first of all, which clocks are you using?
So we're looking at 5 different clocks right now, but that's likely to expand. And I think that we're using some of the open source clocks that were already out there. I can get that information to you. But we've got 3 that go online this month, and then we've got 2 more coming.
How do mere mortals sign up to get their clocks read?
Well, you can just go to the BioViva website, bioviva-science.com, and you can order the kit. And again, it's going to get better and better over the next year, all the data that you get, and then we're going to expand that data. So by being part of that, you help. If you want to share your data, you don't have to, but if you want to share your data, you help the March to Cure Aging. Because the people who participate in what's called the BioKeeper Vault, putting their health data in there, participating in the timekeeper, become the controls for our gene therapy group. So we're able to match people by age and health to the people who are actually participating in the therapeutics, and that way we don't have to go through the old route of doing therapies. I really think that our integrative health systems platform of drug development and getting humans access will be a program that will be moved into the United States in the next 5 years. We're going to show how we can do things safely. We can gather even more data than what's expected, and we can move technology forward. We can find out what drugs work and what drugs don't work. So we're pretty excited about that.
Liz?
Yeah.
Hey, okay, hi again. Are you aware of Deep Longevity that recently was announced? DeepLongevity.com, because I think that they're going to be offering, well, I know they're going to be offering multiple clocks, and I think they'll be hard to compete with in terms of quality. I don't know how you're set up in terms of data and you want to collect the data and so forth, but I just think there'll be third parties emerging, particularly Deep Longevity, who will provide better clock. You just won't be able to compete with them on the clock front.
I don't think that that's a big concern of ours. I think that we'll show, look, the differentiation is we basically built this epigenetic clock to analyze patients' data for the patients who are taking regenerative gene therapies. The power and the knowledge in that is exponential. So in the next few years, that will be the most cutting edge clock, but that's not really our goal. Our goal is to use it as a research tool. So how it ends up spinning out will be much different than how it starts. So we're not in competition with anyone. We're actually working to cure aging.
I think I get you. I think I agree. So thank you for that.
We don't want to use a third party clock on people's, very fragile and personal data. So we actually have a lot of
research. You're just wanting a gauge of where it's going. You're not trying to become the world's optimal biological age determinator.
Well, I think we can do that, but I think the biological age of the future, what your epigenetics should look like for maximum lifespan, is not what it looks like today. The genetic expression of the future human is not going to fit the mold of supercentenarians. So that's not really our goal. Our goal is more of a future shot of finding out what regenerative therapies work, how that matches with your biomarkers, and how that affects your biological aging. So our goal is extrapolated from actual patient data based on what happens for a human that stays closer to homeostasis. So again, we're not, our goal isn't what's healthy for an 85-year-old today, we're what's healthy for an 85-year-old in the future. So our clock is going to change dramatically in that sense. And we have a multitude of research projects from Israel to the United States to Europe, where we're working with new biomarkers and new testing systems that we're not launching as products yet, but we may in the future. And they're all based around what do you actually need for regenerative medicine, not what do people generally need today.
Thank you. Carl also had a question.
So you mentioned therapeutically wanting to address multiple hallmarks, maybe not all of them, I can't remember. Where are you in research-wise on, the epigenetic clocks are great, but they're this one number. Where are you on trying to find clocks, in terms of providing access, or on developing new ones yourself that specifically diagnose or assess individual hallmarks?
Right, and that's a great question. So when you're looking at epigenetics, for instance, gosh, I can't remember your name right now. Love you, CEO of OneSkin. They've been able to develop their own clocks on skin aging by working with skin. I mean, I think it's fantastic, and we'll do the same things by working on regenerative medicine. We're looking at a multitude of proteomics, antibodies, in various other areas that will expand into testing as we go. Obviously, we're in the early stages now, but I'm guessing that the biomarkers that we pull out will be the biomarkers that medicine moves forward with. So, for instance, when you talked about working with the hallmarks of aging, today, look, I just did some blood work yesterday, and they test for some rudimentary blood markers that can change. They even change if you've just eaten. But in the future, the biomarkers are going to be around, the epigenetics are going to be around your telomere length. Even though it's not a great gauge of biological age, especially later in life, it is a gauge of disease state in people who haven't had gene therapies. We'll be looking at a multitude of new biomarkers that will become mainstream, because they'll give medical providers a better picture of what's happening with your health. And so you can expect to see some changes there. And then on the multi-gene delivery for aging, this is an ongoing project. It's very, very exciting. It's more exciting than I thought it would be at this point. And, that's really where the future lies, is targeting as many of those. So biomarkers and hallmarks of aging, the tie-in here is that those are the things that we're going to be looking at. Do you suffer from, so right now we say, do you suffer from cardiovascular disease? Do you suffer from, a risk of cancer? Do you suffer from, a risk of dementia? In the future, we'll be saying, do you suffer from a risk of mitochondrial dysfunction, telomere attrition? Oh, you have stem cell depletion. So how do we address that? We'll be addressing new things medically rather than, giving statins for high LDLs. And the biomarkers are all going to be based around those. So you can expect to see those develop over the next couple decades.
Thank you. Okay. I think for now, I'm seeing Anthony popping up here again. So I just want to see, Anthony, do you think you're ready with your presentation? Because otherwise, you can also send me the slides and I will show them, and then you just tell me click, 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 and I'll go for it. And then Liz mentioned already, I don't know if you were here when she did, that she also has a few comments specifically to your project.
Oh yeah. I just switched clients, and if this button doesn't work for sharing, then I will just put the link in the chat for everyone. And I would appreciate if you could share them on my behalf, but everyone can follow along as well. Let me just
I will. Everyone's usually very happy to get their hands on the slides early, so it's probably pretty good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Liz, for stepping in early.
Perhaps you can enable that, or I will just send you the link.
You are able to share it right now.
Okay. Let me see. Here we go. All right. Excellent.
Ta-da! Lovely. Okay.
And I will, if I can get back to the chat, I will also drop that link for everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Here you go. All right.
You're a little choppy. If you want to save your bandwidth, then put your video off, if you don't mind.
Yeah, right. Okay, is that an improvement?
This is great.
No.
Excellent. Okay. And away we go. Yeah. So again, don't want to get too DARPA presentation style here, but there was a lot to keep track of here. As Allison mentioned, my main project right now is the Open Insulin Project, and this isn't really directly related to it. This isn't something that we're pursuing in that project, but it's something that I've been looking into personally on the side over the years, and a lot of the motivations are the same as the Open Insulin Project. And I think some of the kind of institutional context of why the problems are so urgent are kind of the same on both sides. So I'm going to speak a little bit about that, but it's not something that we're working on there. So first, a little bit of background on what diabetes is. Probably many of you are familiar with this, but I'll just try to recap it with eye to the most relevant things to the rest. So there is in diabetes a mismatch between the ability of the pancreas to make insulin and the ability of the peripheral tissues to respond to it. Insulin causes the peripheral tissues to take glucose that is circulating into the cells and use it for growth or storage of energy in the case of adipose tissue in the liver. There are two main types of diabetes. There are also other ones that have somewhat less common mechanism behind them, but the first main type involves some sort of an injury to the beta cells of the pancreas, which produce insulin, and this means that there is no insulin or insufficient insulin to get the peripheral tissues to take in the glucose, so they are starved of energy. And one of the most obvious results of this is that there is a wasting syndrome. Your muscle and your fat is deprived of energy, and you waste away for that reason. And there are many other very serious effects of that, but that is one that we're going to be discussing in some other contexts. In type 2, your peripheral tissues don't respond to insulin as efficiently as they otherwise might. So this often starts with a metabolic syndrome that may or may not be associated with obesity that has a lot of aspects, but is associated in this reduction in insulin sensitivity. It, oddly enough, overlaps with some the other syndromes that are associated with chronic overproduction of stress hormones, such as Cushing's disease. You get increase in abdominal fat, you get resistance to insulin, you get these kinds of things in both cases. So this is kind of, I think, some circumstantial evidence that the mechanisms of chronic stress and chronic inflammation are implicated here, and that is also relevant to senescence and aging. So I wanted to mention that. In both cases, you have this excess glucose that is circulating. Glucose, for the same kind of physical chemistry reasons that make it a good energy source, is also fairly reactive, similar to oxygen, in fact. It can react energetically, so it can react somewhat spontaneously, so it will circulate and it will glycate your proteins and your other substances and your other tissues and damage them. It will, stick a glucose at a fairly random place that doesn't belong, and it will, break the other things in your body. And the products of this are the advanced glycation end products, AGEs, and they produce inflammation through this mechanism that is mediated by a receptor for them, which detects them and triggers a response to clean them up. And it is related to one of the inflammatory pathways, the bradykinin pathway. And this pathway results in changes to blood vessels, among other things. It makes the small blood vessels permeable, and this is a mechanism for it damaging capillary circulation, and that damages the retinas and causes retinopathy and blindness. It causes kidney damage, and damage to the peripheral nerves that are dependent on the capillary circulation. And that is also something that we're going to see a theme occurring later. So this was a really interesting talk that I recommend to anyone who hasn't seen it. It was on July 30th. The Simons Institute posted it. It's called The Mathematical Essence of Aging, so it has a really nice overview. I took a few screenshots of this. So in aging, senescent cells arise and increase in their prevalence in tissues. They stop dividing and they start releasing inflammatory signals. And here in the background, we see a couple of mice there. This was the result of a study in how to combat the accumulation of senescent cells, but they're the same age, they lived in the same conditions. One of them is all shriveled up and has the dull coat and shriveled, squinty eyes and ears, and the other one, it looks, young and healthy. And this was just a result of clearing out the senescent cells in the one and leaving nature take its course in the other. So we can see here the list of diseases that is associated with cellular senescence, and there's a tremendous overlap here in the complications of diabetes, it turns out. The list, I don't know if you can all read it, but the list is glaucoma, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, atherosclerosis, liver cirrhosis, glomerular sclerosis, i.e. kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, which leads to many of these other things itself, cachexia and sarcopenia, which are different wasting syndromes, and osteoarthritis. So there's a tremendous overlap here between the complications, long-term complications of diabetes and just aging in general, and there's potentially this common inflammatory mechanism at play here. So cardiovascular disease is one of the main concerns in diabetes, and I found this study that established a connection between senescence-induced inflammation and atherosclerosis, so there's a fairly direct connection in this case. And since it is such an important and timely topic, and since I was finding some connections here, I found I'd like to share some of the things I found about diabetes and inflammation and COVID. I mentioned that in diabetic retinopathy and other circulatory complications of diabetes, there's this bradykinin pathway that is mediating that, and a recent computational study that I think was looking at gene expression patterns found that that same mechanism may be at play in some of the very serious complications that develop with COVID, where the circulatory system in the lungs will start to leak fluid into the lungs, and that will be a very serious and life-threatening condition when that develops. And so they're finding here that this may be a kind of acute version of a bradykinin storm, which is the acute version of this chronic thing that is seen in diabetes and is damaging the small vessels there. So this is interesting in part because we've seen that aging and diabetes are risk factors for COVID-related mortality. So now we're starting to see that there's a plausible mechanism here. And as I was looking around in this area of the research, I found also that growth hormone releasing hormone has been used to combat lung damage of roughly this type, and associated with inflammation at least. And growth hormone releasing hormone is also something that people, notably Brian Hanley, did in a gene therapy experiment to combat aging. So this was also an interesting connection here. coming back from the COVID tangent, just wanted to speak to some of these, mechanisms for treating both diabetes and aging, and further develop the theme of how they might overlap. So very broadly speaking, insulin is the first line treatment for type 1 diabetes. There's really no alternative to that. You have to supplement the insulin that's lacking. And as type 2 diabetes progresses, you need to administer it as well. But aside from that, there are also these, efforts to not just treat that most proximate cause, but to address the other metabolic derangements that develop. So there are drugs that influence lipid metabolism, such as fibrates, which act through the PPAR alpha mechanism. That's a nuclear receptor that coordinates a lot of gene expression patterns to control lipid metabolism, and also drugs that influence carbohydrate metabolism, such as metformin. On the aging side, a family of drugs that was developed in around 20 years ago, I think through high throughput screening of small molecules. It turns out, part of that generation, it was a class of small molecules, or a few classes of small molecules called SARMs, or selective androgen receptor modulators, were developed. They are kind of like steroids without most of the side effects. They found a way to activate the androgen receptor, but only in muscle and bone tissue, or with a very high differential between its activity in muscle and bone tissue and other tissues, so that you would get the desired effect of combating the wasting of muscles and the embrittling of bones that happens with aging, without the side effects from activating it in tissues that are associated with sexual aspects and that sort of thing. And that is related to what Liz here and BioViva did, which a big part of that was to inhibit myostatin, which is perhaps the main negative feedback signal on muscle growth, with follistatin, which binds it and activates it. And this, I'm sure we could hear more about that from the source, but the intent of that is to preserve and build muscle mass and go against these trends of it going away and leaving one in a perhaps more vulnerable metabolic state that is part of this nexus of changes. So yeah, I just said a bit about that. Here are a few citations. You can pull these out of the slides, I suppose. Unfortunately, I didn't include these as text as opposed to screenshots, but that resource is there for you. So elaborating a bit on the inflammation and the potential coronavirus connection, there was another class of small molecule drugs that was developed called plasma cylocrane inhibitors. This is, I think, one of the rate-limiting bits of this inflammatory pathway that's implicated in diabetic retinopathy and these other small blood vessel diseases. But there's another much more common inhibitor of many inflammatory pathways that I found while I was poking around, PEA, which has already been used on influenza and the common cold. So, I think this is a potential candidate to look into for dealing with these coronavirus complications and perhaps also the other complications of diabetes. So, that's a little tangent into some treatment possibilities that are off the the main path of gene therapy, but I thought were worth mentioning since people have been looking into this. I'd like to come back to the diabetes problem and look at why it's such an urgent problem, and what some of our motivations were to try to address it with the Open Insulin Project. So there were about 422 million adults living with diabetes in 2014. now it's projected to be over 500 million. We were trying to get a crude estimate of how many people were dying due to lack of insulin. This is difficult because there isn't a lot of direct data on whether someone's cause of death is due to lack of insulin or not, if that person is living in a place that doesn't have much of a health system such that they can't even get insulin in the first place. So this was a little bit speculative. We were just trying to get an order of magnitude estimate on this, but if we look at the prevalence of diabetes in places where that's known and project that out to the rest of the world, it's not necessarily the best methodology, but we took it as a starting point and looked at the figure that 50% of people globally who need insulin to survive aren't able to obtain it. We arrived at just an order of magnitude estimate that this is about the same amount of people dying. People are dying at the same rate as they were because of World War II, which is about 12 million per year. So this is order of magnitude. This is a crisis of the first order. This is something that is on par roughly with the deadliest conflict in history. So there's a tremendously urgent need to address this. We found that the reason that insulin isn't available is essentially that the production of it is oligopolized, and these oligopoly producers are not interested in providing it to about half the people in the world who need it because they find it unprofitable. So the cost of manufacture is around $5 per vial. The list prices go from $300 to $600 per vial in some cases. There are only 3 manufacturers. They've been increasing the price in lockstep for about 20 years. About a quarter of the people who use it in the US have rationed it at some point, and as I mentioned, half the people in the world who don't have it. We see that there are a lot of perverse incentives playing into this state of affairs. This was a fairly striking headline that I found. The investors in medicine do not find gene therapy to be a very compelling business proposition. Curing your patients is not viewed as a sustainable business model. So even treating them is sometimes not, but certainly curing them does not seem to be either, according to the prevailing incentives. So we tried to answer that by using our our own unique strengths in our community. We share knowledge in commons. We work in a low overhead way in distributed networks, and the stakeholders in the work can participate directly in it. And that is the model that we are pursuing for producing insulin. We're taking a lot of inspiration from precedents in the broader open source world in software, and now emerging in computing hardware as well, and other areas. And we're part of trying to bring this to medicine. So that is kind of the context in which I'm looking to pursue some ideas in gene therapy cure for diabetes. It seems pretty clear to me that it's not going to be possible to get the typical kind of biotech investment, because that's just not where the incentives of the investors lie. So kind of looking for a way to do this outside of that system and more in keeping with what we've been doing with Open Insulin. So to that end, I've been looking at a particular line of research that goes back to 2000 ultimately, but there have been some regular developments. The most recent one was in 2017, where there was long-term follow-up on this strategy and was very successful. This strategy introduced glucokinase gene and a gene for the constitutive expression of insulin into skeletal muscle via an AAV vector. So a little review on what is going on there and why that might work. The way that insulin causes muscle tissue and adipose tissue to take in insulin is it binds to the insulin receptor on those cells, and the GLUT4 glucose transporter, which is normally stored inside the cell, inactive in vesicles, then migrates to the cell membrane and integrates with the cell membrane and becomes active, and it permits glucose to traverse the cell membrane. And under the conditions when insulin is normally going to be circulating, the concentration on the outside of the cell is higher than on the inside, and the cell will take in the glucose and metabolize it. But obviously somewhere in the body, this can't be mediated by insulin. So in some tissues, including in the pancreas, which has the job of initially sensing this condition of high available glucose and sending this signal, there's another system, and it involves a different transporter, and also involves glucokinase, which is able to phosphorylate glucose, which prepares it for metabolism by other pathways independent of insulin. So the strategy here was to get the muscle cells constitutively expressing insulin at a small enough rate that it wouldn't just of itself cause excess metabolism of glucose, because that's very risky. If you have too much insulin, it will cause your peripheral tissues to take up too much of the glucose and will deprive your central nervous system of glucose and throw you into a coma and give you seizures and possibly kill you. So you don't want that, but they were able to, apparently with some consistency, get this expressing at a low level to keep the GLUT4 transporters mobilized and active, and then the glucokinase facilitated the metabolism of glucose in a concentration-dependent way. So glucokinase is a very interesting enzyme. It only phosphorylates the glucose at a rate that is proportional to the concentration of glucose, and it's kind of tuned to the desired physiological concentration, so that it only becomes active when it gets out of the normal range for humans. So that was their approach there. As I mentioned, this is a fairly risky approach because it involves this constitutive expression of insulin. So I've been looking into some alternatives for glucose responsive expression of insulin and other transporters that would potentially permit the glucose to enter the cells initially without insulin, and then that could be used to kick off the process and mobilize the other transporters. So, I'm still kicking this around, but tentatively I think I've got a way to do this. And I have been, greatly inspired by what Liz Parrish and Brian Hanley have done in this vein. I am looking forward to doing what I can to be the first human subject for this after I can vet these changes I'd like to make with an animal experiment. And that is both because, I have type 1 diabetes and just about everyone in my family has had type 2, but also because of this really urgent global need to eradicate diabetes and the potential synergies between diabetes and other metabolic disease and aging suggests to me that I could try to get everyone together in an alliance here to pool our resources and not only attack some of the core phenomena of aging, but also eradicate diabetes at the same time. There are a few more technicalities here, and I would, that I could discuss with anyone interested, and I am ready and eager to discuss with anyone who might like to collaborate on this. And with that, I will let us get on to the proper discussion.
All right. Thank you so much. let's see. Liz, do you want to make a few comments directly? And otherwise, I think we already have Creon queued up, and anyone else who'd like to make comments, collect them with the queue in the chat.
Well, I really appreciate your pioneering spirit, and certainly that's some of the fastest way to get things done is to actually get human data. I do have a paper that I want you to look at, and something that might be based in gene therapy that might be a safer mode of expression, turning cells in the gut lining that turn over quite quickly into beta cells that are responsive to blood glucose levels and act just like regular beta cells, but may be able to evade the response of the immune system. And I would just give that to you for free. You know, diabetes is close to me, and I feel for you 100%. By 2030, over a 500 million people will have diabetes, and it will be the 7th leading cause of death. But in 2013 is the reason that I even found aging research. I went to one of Aubrey's conferences because the professor of genetics was speaking there, because I was looking for cures for kids. My son had just been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, a disease I knew nothing about. And it's tough. It's tough, and it's a killer. And, you know, the myostatin inhibitors are fantastic. So far, we've showed in every patient they have reduced blood glucose levels. But as aging progresses in humans and we don't stop the ravages of other parts of aging, we don't know the long-term glucose control. So having backups like this is absolutely essential to the human race. Metabolic disorder is something that everyone will eventually suffer from who doesn't look at long-term fixes. So I'm going to pull out some research and get you in touch with a scientist that I know. Again, I support you 100% in your decision making. I understand that the time is now, that these diseases are deadly. Everyone who has type 1 diabetes, everyone considers it a manageable disease, but in fact, dead in bed is a real thing. People die every day of the disease, and we've known several. So this is a life-threatening disease. I support you, and I will get in touch with you privately about the research that I think looks really promising, and give you any support to the research that you're doing that I can.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Awesome. Okay, I think Creon, you also had a few points.
Well, yeah. All right, you guys, I'm sorry. I have to object to almost everything that was said, in particular, but not the details. The details are fine. And also not so much about type 1 diabetes, because it's a separate issue. It's a less prevalent condition. And to be sure, type 1 diabetics do need a reliable and inexpensive source of insulin. Minimal insulin, by the way, you don't want to get over dependent and get into a hyperinsulinemia situation, which is basically what type 2 diabetes is. Type 2 diabetes should not be treated with insulin. Type 2 diabetes should be treated with carbohydrate restriction. This has been known for well over 100 years. It was kind of forgotten about, but it's now coming back, and tens of thousands of people have reversed their type 2 diabetes and gotten off of all insulin and gotten off of all medications, and obviously then have no need for gene therapies or even new drugs, because you can simply break the cycle. The cycle is this: people eat too many carbs, they get hyperglycemia or highly variable blood glucose, they produce more and more insulin, they get more and more insulin resistant, then they need to produce more and more insulin, then eventually, for various reasons, some call it exhaustion of the islet cells in the pancreas, but it's also fat accumulation in the pancreas and everything, because more and more insulin makes you more and more obese, makes you more and more insulin resistant, eventually so quote unquote requiring the use of external insulin, which is the beginning of the death sentence. Once you are on external insulin, it is an inevitable pathway to neuropathy, obesity, blindness, renal failure, just a horrible set of conditions which wind up with debilitating, multi-year, miserable death. Okay, so the thing is that And not only, and it also, this hyperinsulinemia and this insulin resistance does not just lead to diabetes. It leads to coronary heart disease. It leads to dementia, which causes even Alzheimer's is now called type 3 diabetes. It leads to autoimmune diseases. It leads to frailty. It leads to susceptibility to viral infections and bacterial infections, and probably susceptibility to cancer and other degenerative diseases. It's largely all driven by high glucose levels and high glucose variability, leading to high insulin and insulin resistance. And the way to break the cycle is not by giving insulin and not by giving drugs. The way to break the cycle is to get people off of high glucose loaded foods and high fructose loaded foods, decreasing, restricting carbohydrates, okay? Increased use of insulin, drugs, gene therapies, et cetera, as a cure for diabetes is missing the forest for the trees, at least for type 2. It's missing the elephant in the room, and it's basically playing into the same flawed business model, which has brought us here with the sick care industry and making people sicker and sicker with more and more drugs that make them more and more insulin resistant and more diabetic. We're caught in this feedback loop, eventually leading to the large amounts of external insulin and all the death and crippling disasters that come after that. And this has been brought on by the authorities, the NIH, the CDC, the American Medical Association, the American Diabetes Association, and the American Heart Association, basically promoting low-fat, high-carb diets for 50 years, which has been coincident with the explosion in diabetes and all these other degenerative diseases. And also telling people to shun fat, and particularly shun saturated fat, and meanwhile pushing an explosion in the consumption of carbohydrates and polyunsaturated fats by the US population and worldwide, leading to utter disaster, leading to the 20 million deaths a year from diabetes alone that Anthony was talking about, and many worse problems, all this glycation and all this heart disease and all this hypertension and all this COVID.
Okay,
is all from the same thing. Okay, almost done. Okay, now I'm going to just say the last thing. This is exemplified by Tracy Brown, who's one of tens of thousands of people who have announced that they reversed their type 2 diabetes, got off of all insulin and all medications. Who is Tracy Brown? Why do I single her out amongst the tens of thousands? She was recently on 2 60 Minutes interviews. She is the head of the American Diabetes Association. And she, even in that position, with reversing her own diabetes, she cannot get her own organization to promote carbohydrate restriction as the first line of defense for type 2 diabetes. Instead, it's all about insulin and drugs. And I'm really sorry about that. We've got to change it. And then once we've gotten people unhooked from carbs and PUFAs, then for the remaining cases, the difficult cases, and to some extent for type 1 diabetes, we can manage it with insulin, drugs, and gene therapies. That's fine. But let's not miss the forest for the trees. The problem is too much carbohydrate consumption, and too much consumption probably also of polyunsaturated fatty acids.
Anthony, what would you like to say?
Yeah. Your points, I think, are very well received. And for the people who can, kind of have the economic freedom to do these kinds of lifestyle modifications, I think that is great. Speaking of not missing the forest for the trees, I think you have to account for the economic context. We've seen that be decisive in the question of access to insulin. Why are starches and vegetable oils so prevalent? Is because for thousands of years the society has been on an agricultural economic base, and that's the cheapest calories that you can produce on that economic base. And the food pyramid was created by the U.S. Department of Agriculture because that was the supply, and they needed to create the demand. And I think as long as you have that, and as long as you have a system where the laws and the guidelines can be bought, and it's on this base of what is the technical basis of civilization and the economy and how people are fed, this is going to be a very difficult problem to get any kind of large scale change in lifestyle, unless maybe you create a machine that can just turn starch into protein. Maybe that machine. Yeah,
the machine is called an animal. The machine is called an animal.
Yeah. So a lot of animals are really energy intensive, like cows, and some of them are less so, like crickets, and maybe we can do that, but that is still a tremendous undertaking to make that kind of a shift. And in the meantime, I think it's really important to have other options And, I mean, even if I didn't have type 1 diabetes, I would probably still be really interested in something that was going to change how my energy gets partitioned and directed towards my muscles in the environment that we're in. There's nothing at the chemical level wrong with glucose. It's just how my body responds to it that is what is wrong with it. So if I can change that, then to me, that's a perfectly valid way of solving the problem. And if you develop this gene therapy to a point of maturity, it could be something that could just be done for perhaps a couple $1,000s a person. And that's like a few months of insulin for someone, or, any of these other cutting edge drugs. So, I mean, I think for those for whom what you're advocating works, it is great. And everyone who can pursue that and is interested in it should. I still think there's going to be a need for other options there.
All right, thank you. Well, yeah, I think both approaches don't seem mutually exclusive, right? At least for testing both out. So is there anyone else who would like to make a comment, who has a question?
It's kind of awkward because I agree with Crayon, but I also agree with Anthony, so I'm good.
All right. Anyone else? Any questions or suggestions? Yes, John, you're raising your hand. Go for it.
I didn't hear much talk about fiber. I think fiber can help to slow down the absorption of carbohydrate and sugar. And that, so as I talked about last week, a fruit and vegetable diet has a lot of fiber, which I think may be overlooked if Creon is only thinking about eating pasta and Coca-Cola.
So just to catch everybody up verbally who's not reading the chat. So I and others agree with Creon that type 2 diabetes, at least, it should be completely reversible with lifestyle, but you don't necessarily need carb restriction. And that's exactly the key point that John just made, is that there's lots of whole food, plant-based, vegan, high percentage carb diet advocates who are reversing diabetes very, very successfully with whole food, plant-based diets as well. And in fact, some of them even poo-poo the low carb idea. I don't do that. I can't paraphrase that, and do it justice. But for example, there's Dr. Greger podcasts on nutritionfacts.org that you can go read on diabetes, where he says carb restriction, he makes the analogy that that's kind of like, not standing up if you have a broken leg and claiming that will cure the broken leg. You don't know if it's really cured until you stand up.
I think that I have real problems with that guy, as I spoke with you offline about, his claims just come up false one after the other.
I pointed out in the chat, he's not the only one, right? It's just he's not a lone wolf, right? So the whole food plant-based advocate who's made it his mission to specialize in diabetes more than anybody else is Neil Bernard, and he has a book. I put it in the chat, a link to it. You can read the reviews on Amazon. But whichever dietary or lifestyle path you choose, it's very clear that type 2 diabetes is accessible. There may be uses for insulin and other things short term for acute cases, because that might improve health faster than lifestyle changes can. And also the connection to COVID is very interesting, right? If you have diabetes that's not under control, obviously it's not possible to go and get a gene therapy to cure it right now as a COVID preventative. But perhaps there are other things that you can do that aren't just lifestyle that might work fast to help bring it under control. And that could actually be a useful thing for dropping COVID risk quickly.
Lifestyle interventions, by the way, can have a huge effect in a matter of days. Of course, they have a bigger effect in a matter of months. But people shouldn't think that A, it's expensive, B, it's hard, or C, that it takes that long. You can actually get your glucose variability under control in a matter of days if you start restricting carbs. So I don't have much more to say on that. I don't see why people are just grasping for high-tech profit-making solutions before we address the elephant in the room, which is the standard American diet and the disaster that it has been. Whether you replace it with a plant-based or an animal-based alternative, the fact is that there are dietary interventions which are not hard that can reverse type 2 diabetes. And it's time people started being honest about that, in my opinion.
So I think we're all in agreement that in a COVID risk world, everyone should be trying to minimize sugar, junk food, right? Because that all the different advocates of different style diets, that different style diets all agree with that. And that kind of food will clearly increase inflammatory signaling, which is going to increase COVID risk. I'd be curious for the speakers to comment, if they have any comments on this, about, if you're obese, you have an increased COVID risk. That can be addressed with lifestyle, but there's this interesting work, and I don't know if maybe anybody here knows much about it, on like starve a fever but feed a cold. There seems to be scientific evidence behind that, from at least from rodent studies, that shows that in the face of a bacterial infection, restricting calories can be good, but in the face of a viral infection, restricting calories seems to exacerbate the infection and make outcomes worse. So it's sort of like this weird long-term versus short-term trade-off, where if you're overweight and you have a higher insulin resistance and you have a higher inflammatory signaling, your risk of cytokine storm from COVID is worse. And so you want to bring that down if you know you're going to get infected in several weeks or months. But if you're going to get infected tomorrow, dropping weight quickly might actually be counterproductive. But I haven't dug into that literature in the COVID world to see what I think the implications are.
Does anyone have any comments on that, or is aware of the literature?
Well, I don't know if Liz is still around.
Yep, she's here.
Yeah, I don't mean to bug you, Liz, but I asked you a similar question once that Crayon is raising, and you answered it. I just want to say you had a particular ideology or viewpoint when I asked you a similar question, which was, hey, we're actually accelerating aging. Humanity is, by not having enough magnesium, by not having enough zinc, by not having enough selenium. And there's this longevity industry pushing for gene therapy and that, and nobody's even pushing that people have enough magnesium so that their enzymes function correctly. It's crazy. But you had an answer to that. Could you briefly just state what you have said before, Liz, in your opinion?
Well, I think that, there's a way to partition this. So one of the people that I really love in the diet and exercise is Ray Cronise. He's reversed his own type 2 diabetes. He's put himself back into a diabetic state and did, daily monitoring, fasting, and diet control. And he has been able to get his type 2 in control. But and magnesium, just go to any A4M conference. There's hundreds of doctors. They've got thousands of doctors in their network that are pushing micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. This is all basic low-hanging stuff, and it is things that people who are interested in their health should do. But we don't stop innovating. We don't stop gene therapy. This isn't about profits. This is about curative medicine. So as much as I appreciate Ray Cronise's work, we work together. We've done some podcasts, and I support all his books and the multitude of famous people that he's actually gotten to reduce their weight, come out of diabetic states, and stay there with his vegan diets that are high carb. We are looking for, and I think that Anthony is looking for, more than that. We're looking for more expansion into Healthspan. We're looking for extending human lifespan as well as Healthspan. We're looking to get more out of life than the lower hanging fruits. And we're also realists. A lot of the world, you can tell them some healthy things that they can do today. They won't do them if they inconvenience that person. People are vastly based in feeling. They love that piece of chocolate cake. It gives them meaning. What is life worth living for without that? And so, we don't stop innovating because there are some what some people might find very difficult things to do. We continue innovating. And so looking towards the future, towards the gene therapies, towards the curative effects who will benefit everybody here and everybody who is watching this, is something that we're going to continue to do regardless of low-hanging fruit. Should people have a good diet and exercise? Absolutely. And there's a lot of literature on that. There's a lot of information out there. Should you make sure that you're not deficient? in micronutrients, absolutely you should do that. And really people have to take it upon themselves. But Anthony and I will continue to do our research into gene therapy, simplifying people's lives as much as possible so that with single injections, they can live a more healthful and fruitful life without nitpicking the incidentals.
Thank you so much. And Anthony, would you like to say a few words too?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I just want to, emphasize I don't see anything wrong with improving your health through this low-hanging fruit, right? It's just that isn't going to work for everyone, and it might actually only be practical for many fewer people than you might think. Just because of these economic factors that are behind a lot of what people are doing now, and just personal preferences about things. And if I really just go down to the fundamentals of it, like there's nothing wrong with starch and there's nothing wrong with a lot of these things. It's just that we aren't adapted to them, and if we can adapt ourselves to them, then and it doesn't have to cost a lot. It doesn't have to. I don't think it will happen in the profit-driven, big biotech world for the reasons I discussed. Like, they don't want to cure people. They want to keep this, this industry of managing people's sicknesses growing, and they're banking on it. It's going to be a $500 billion a year industry very soon. It's already, very, just in the U.S. Like, it's huge, and it is driving a lot of economic activity. And part of my motivation is actually to, pop that bubble and make it so that isn't a way to extract wealth from the public. And that is going to involve changing how the system works, changing the incentives at a really fundamental level. And, people have been advocating for lifestyle changes for decades, and it's had a very limited effect. So I want to try something in addition to that.
And so if you maybe could repeat, for everyone who's present, just like, what are your next steps exactly, and how do you think this group could help you reach those?
Well, I wanted to address this group because I know there are a lot of people who are interested in pursuing this sort of thing, and I saw an overlap of interest in, the diabetes, gene therapy, and anti-aging approaches, and I just wanted to see if anyone is in a position to collaborate. I am going to be completing a grant that I have been working on in the Open Insulin Project at the end of October, and I'm going to be looking for another way to make a living in another project. And if anyone would like to, collaborate with me to try to pursue this, I think that would be ideal. So I thought this was one place that I could look for potential collaborators. And I can tell many people here have a deep background in these topics and some degree of interest in many aspects of this. So I just wanted to, see who might be interested in going further with this.
Thank you so much. I would love for you if you could send me any, first the slides, you have to request access. So please give people access if they want to dig into the slides. I think I at least wasn't able to yet. And then I would love to send out the slides that you have to the group afterwards, and any follow-up points from both Liz and Anthony, you would be much appreciated. Okay, I see another comment from John and Liz, and then we'll move into the breakout. Yes, John.
I have a question for Anthony, and that is, why, with this huge profit margin, are only 3 companies making insulin? Wouldn't it be an opportunity for another company or several other companies to jump in and bring out lower cost insulin?
You would think that, but yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, yeah. So, if markets were efficient and so on, then that would be the case, and this situation probably never would have developed in the first place. But what we have is a pretty textbook example of a cartel operating, and they have a number of anti-competitive practices that they engage in, and they are often supported by the various, mainly the FDA seems to have a kind of symbiotic relationship with them in terms of maintaining those kinds of things. And there's this idea that you need to give these companies a subsidy to fund their R&D, but when you look at their budgets, that doesn't really pan out. They aren't really spending that much on R&D, and the fundamental research is done outside of the companies in publicly funded research, and what they are spending on is like executive and shareholder compensation and marketing. That's their top line expenditures, and nonetheless, the rhetoric of giving them the subsidy of monopoly is out there, and there's a number of anti-competitive practices that they have turned, institutionalized. There's a book called An American Sickness that I recommend if you want to learn more about the perversion of the healthcare system in that way. One of the most notorious practices is called pay for delay, where there will be a new entrant that is threatening to compete with an incumbent's existing product, and they will launch a quite possibly frivolous patent lawsuit or another lawsuit, whatever they can, cook up against them, and then they'll offer to settle the lawsuit on very generous terms if they refrain from competing for, say, 10 or 20 years. So it's almost like getting a second iteration of patent monopoly out of them. And this is something that even the Federal Trade Commission has urged Congress to look into and to regulate and ban. But right now they get away with all kinds of things like this, the incumbent manufacturers, and it's another example of these kinds of perverse incentives. And I actually have an Open Insulin presentation where I go into a little bit more detail about this, so I can share that as well.
Well, suppose I were to start an insulin company. What could they do to stop me?
Well, we are basically doing that in Open Insulin, so I can kind of tell you a little bit about how it's going for us there. The main patents that we might have needed to be concerned about have expired over the last 4 or 5 years or so, and that has resulted in a number of centralized, typical manufacturing and production efforts trying to come into the field. There was an alternative to Lantus called Basaglar that came on the market in December 2016, I believe, that was only priced about 10-15% lower than the original that it was based on, and it was made by another member of the cartel. I believe there's an effort in process for Biocon to enter the U.S. market. I heard from an executive who tried to enter the European market from them, and he told me a sad story about how they sank about $300 million into development and setting up the manufacturing facility and a fair amount of clinical trials, and then right at the end, after they'd sunk all this money, and the EU regulators used their very broad discretion, which is very similar to what the US ones have, and they just said, no, you're rejected. So there isn't always even a reason, just because of the amount of discretion that they have, and there's a lot of room to suspect that because of regulatory capture and because of the revolving door between the companies that are being regulated and the regulators, there's a lot of room to suspect that it's not a system you can always rely on to provide a rational outcome. So in our project, we're trying to be very careful around these issues. We are choosing how we engage with regulators very carefully. We are making sure to emphasize the urgency of the public health crisis and to we've structured our effort in a way that is clearly not for profit, and has the direct participation of people with insulin, and that's like built into the governance structure that we have. And we're looking to set up cooperatives to actually manufacture, just so that it's really clear that we have clean hands and impeccable motives, and we won't be able to be derailed in any of these ways that for-profit efforts have been in the recent past. So that's our strategy, and I think more things should be done that way, honestly, just because it's not just a response to these urgent concerns of how anti-competitive practices keep medicine off the market, but it really is better to have the people using the medicine be involved in the governance of the medicine. It solves a lot of problems besides that.
Thank you. Well, we had at least similar structural topics previously when we talked about a Foresight Health Commons and similar arrangements, I think, where you can have like more of a feedback loop between the two. Anyone else who would like to ask a question or make a point? Otherwise, I think Liz, you were also, I think, unmuting yourself just a second ago. So if you had any final words to the group, please go for it.
I see this important problem that Anthony's solving, especially of a parent of a child with type 1. Just, to put things into perspective, insulin is the 6th most expensive liquid in the United States. That's pretty expensive for something that can be pretty easily made. And that should be disseminated to people, but he's going one step farther than that. He's looking for a cure for type 1 diabetes and something that would support type 2. And one thing that I would just like to say to the diet advocates, we have a culture, so we have a cultural issue. So we have a generational cultural issue of how we eat. And I think that we should push agendas to getting people to eat healthier. But if we have the outlook of curative medicine is actually people start treating their bodies better. When people participate in regenerative gene therapies, they want to do more to get the maximum out of their health and their lifespan. So, the hope is that we can work in parallel with good education and get curative effects for people, especially with type 1 diabetes, that there is no diet that can help them. And move into a new future where people are treating themselves better across the board, and that the interest of the basic daily things we can do will become more prevalent and more evident, and more people will participate in them. So I just wanted to thank Anthony for his presentation and bringing this back to my notice, because I've been off somewhere else. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for both of you, Anthony and Liz, for joining and for making your comments. Anthony, I would love to have your slide deck if you have it ready. And Liz, if there's any updates on BioViva, that would be exciting for the group to know. I went on the website and I realized a few of the things were sold out. So I'd be eager to know, and perhaps you can share a little bit of research there as well that we can share with the group. I want to thank you all for taking time and coming. I'm going to open up breakout rooms now for those who'd like to stay on. We're going to do several rooms today so that they're a little smaller, and that those who'd like to stay on can chat. And it would be amazing if at the beginning of the breakout room you could introduce yourself, maybe even in the chat, say a few words about yourself, and then perhaps like what project you're currently working on, and whether there's a roadblock that you're encountering that someone in this group may be able to help you with. I'm hoping that I see many of you again next week. I'm going to send around again the feedback form and to help me make those meetings better. Thank you so much for joining. It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for attending again, staying much over time, and breakout rooms are opened, and I will see you again next week. Bye everyone. Have a lovely rest of the week.